Please welcome to the stage, Cheney and Glenn Rockman.
Glenn, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today and for your partnership.
Thanks for having me.
So I got to know Adjuvant Capital in my time reporting on technology and innovation in global health and development for Devex from California. Adjuvant's name would come up quite a bit. And you all are using venture capital tools and strategies to ensure that the most promising public health technologies reach those who are most in need of them. But not everyone in this room may have the same awareness of when you say venture capital tools and strategies, what does that really mean in practice? So today I want to hear how you're doing it, not just what deals you're working on, but how they come together. And I think this is a moment where we're talking about new kinds of actors who are needed to finance these critical global health and development challenges. And I hope we can learn from you about some successes as well as some challenges you've worked through. So just to start, what do these venture capital strategies look like in practice, and what kinds of health challenges do you think are most in need of those types of strategies right now?
Yeah, and people hear venture capital, and I don't know if it sounds like this big mysterious universe of private investors in Silicon Valley and on Wall Street and so on, but it's as simple as just assessing a business model and figuring out, is there a way to build a portfolio of typically high-risk investments. You think of venture capital, you think of technology innovations over the years, whether it's Uber or any of the other or Twitter. People say we were promised flying cars and we got 280 characters or whatever, but still those businesses are in fact very high risk and require a certain appetite and a certain level of thoughtfulness about building a portfolio that doesn't lose money and ideally does a huge amount of financial benefit. And the difference at Adjuvant is that we were created in a certain sense by the Gates Foundation under their global health strategy to apply the idea of building a portfolio of things that probably should make money on the whole, but are overlooked by the rest of the industry because they're just not as sexy as investing in a guaranteed cure for Alzheimer's or ending breast cancer. And as a result, industry, big pharma and biotech startups and the traditional VC industry wasn't putting money into them. But that didn't mean there weren't good business models underneath them. So our job when Gates kind of started this idea was just go out there and find a way to make a portfolio that will deliver a positive financial return and have the same type of social impact as we get from our grants and that you would get from development finance.
And how are you identifying those opportunities? I know a big focus in your portfolio has been new or improved vaccine technologies, but you also look at therapeutics, diagnostics, and devices. There are lots of options out there, lots of things that are overlooked for reasons you just described. How do you pick where to invest your time and money?
It's a simple filter. You find basically the entire universe of technologies that address an overlooked public health challenge, whether it's a diagnostic or a vaccine or a treatment and so on. And then you very quickly whittle that down to, okay, what in this pool is investable? And in practice, what does that mean? I mean, NIH, the Gates Foundation, the Wellcome Trust, the Europeans, everyone is pouring tons of public and charitable resources into academic research and to early stage technologies. And we just try to scrub through those and find the ones that have the best possible chance. And it's not a science, it is a science in a certain sense, but you can't just put it into a computer and get the right answer at the outset. It does require some judgment. And so you try to make assessments as to what are the most promising public health technologies that also have a chance of both succeeding, meaning, yeah, it's an idea in a lab, and then you need to get it through FDA or EMA or WHO approval, and then it needs to make a little bit of money on the other side. So that kind of filtering process is how the whole machine works, at least on our side.
So can you take us through an example or two? You've mentioned financial and social returns. Give us an example or two that kind of illustrate what that looks like in practice. And first, I want to hear about the example, and then I want to hear about how a deal actually comes together to support that.
I'll give two examples, big picture, and you can bucket these into what we call dual market opportunities, things that it doesn't, a disease or a challenge that doesn't discriminate based on where you're born or how much money you make. And something like postpartum hemorrhage is a perfect example. We have a serious issue with that in the U.S. Mothers shouldn't be dying from additional bleeding in childbirth in 2025, and we needed more innovations for that. And the same is true in Africa. And so you can sell a successful product that addresses an issue like postpartum hemorrhage domestically in the U.S. and in Europe at high margins, which is an entirely separate conversation about the U.S. healthcare system. And as a taxpayer, I wish we didn't pay as much as we do for successful products. But the truth of the matter, and this is, I think, widely accepted, is that the U.S. and certain other developed markets do subsidize innovation by using the high prices paid on the other side of these innovations for making new technologies available globally. And then the other example I'd give is something that largely doesn't impact wealthy countries, something like cholera, that if you have access to clean water and sanitation, you're probably not going to get cholera. But places that are either ravaged by natural disasters or refugee situations and so on, a cholera vaccine is super useful. And you rely on large volumes but very low prices to make the product accessible and to achieve the impact that you want, while also, again, earning that financial return that is a core part of our model.
Just to make sure I'm fully capturing this, so something like postpartum hemorrhage, I understand, you mentioned the high prices in the U.S. can help, in other higher income markets, can help to subsidize this investment elsewhere. But for something like cholera, how do you make the math work in terms of the financial return? It's the volume.
Exactly. High volume, low margin, and centralized procurement, regulatory harmonization, and being able to access large markets without building out a huge sales and marketing team. Like in the US, if you're selling a product at a very high margin, you can afford to have 50 people. They have this joke in the healthcare industry that they walk around with suitcases, they go to doctor's office and give out pens and clips and everything, and they convince them to buy their product. You can't do that if you're trying to reach 3 billion people, or what hookworm, I think, might infect 1.2 billion people currently, most of which are children. But you're not going to have traveling suitcase people marketing a new hookworm treatment or a vaccine for that. You need centralized, thoughtful, really efficient funding and procurement strategies to do it. And when you have that, it works.
I want to talk about one other example that you and I discussed briefly in preparing for the session, which is Group B strep. So Group B strep affects about 1 in 4 pregnant women, and at least in the US context, and I know this as a mom of 3, the way it's often handled is you're screened for it, and if you're positive, you're given antibiotics to prevent transmission to your baby. And that transmission can be pretty devastating for babies: sepsis, pneumonia, meningitis. In other parts of the world, obviously, there is not that same process that's being followed, but you have actually backed a Group B strep vaccine to prevent transmission to babies. Tell us more about that, and I think that's actually something where that kind of innovation could have global implications.
Exactly, and that's another perfect example of a dual market opportunity where, even though we have extremely effective Group B strep control methodology in the US, a vaccine, a safe and effective vaccine, would be far better. And that feeds into antimicrobial resistance, which we can talk a bit later. But if you don't have the infrastructure that we have in the US to do the screening and treatment that we do to control it, a vaccine is a far simpler intervention, especially if it can be easily manufactured, easily delivered, and affordable for the populations that need it within health system budgets. So, we are backing a GBS vaccine candidate. There are a couple others in the mix, and it would be such a wonderful innovation that demonstrates just how important this is and how it feeds not into just this core problem, but antimicrobial resistance, which the heavy use of antibiotics in the US and Europe and elsewhere to deal with this might make future problems worse.
Yeah, we hear a lot about concerns around AMR, and this seems like a space where there's a lot of risk with the way it's being handled right now. So in these examples you shared, Group B strep, postpartum hemorrhage, cholera, One of the things I really want to capture in this session is the venture capital approaches that are making deals come together where traditional investments, the traditional tools aren't working, right? And that's why there's a gap, and that's why you're stepping in to fill that gap. So let's take cholera, for example. I told you I might ask you a question along the lines of who called who? Like, how did that deal come together? Give us a sense of there's a gap that you're tracking, and then you and your colleagues at Adjuvant Capital enter the space, and you're able to do something that traditional players have not achieved. Again, for the reasons you mentioned earlier, these issues are overlooked, they're not sexy, et cetera. But maybe cholera is a great example to dive into.
Yeah, it is. And what Catherine's referencing is something that's been covered a lot in the news, which is the global shortage of oral cholera vaccine, just again because of climate and refugee and geopolitical issues that have messed up water and sanitation and so on. And it's not something that your average VC in the US thinks about. And so what you need is a nerd like someone from my team who happened to care about public health and knows how to travel the corners of the NIH and the Gates Foundation and the funders in Geneva and so on, and put the puzzle pieces together to get a deal done. And when I say get a deal done, I mean, okay, we put $1 million into something. It's always much more than that, of course, but I'll just use round numbers. And you have to have a line of sight to how you get a positive return on that $1 million. And the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, as I earlier mentioned, is often large-scale procurement. And something like cholera, where you have to have that large-scale procurement at the end of the rainbow, you need to ensure that your safe and effective product gets in front of the right audience and so on. And so in this case, who called who? It was our team, not me through any special knowledge, but just our relationships with these funders and global health specialists. We knew how to get in front of the procurement team at UNICEF, which had recently been funded by Gavi to initiate oral cholera vaccine contracting. And if that hadn't happened, this company would have withered on the vine. They would have sold a fraction of their annual manufacturing capacity in the regional market in South Korea where they were based. But because of who called who, and we put the pieces together, we turned something that was probably going to be a money loser into what's now, for a while, they were a billion-dollar company, which is huge in our business.
That's a fascinating example. I think you captured earlier pretty well why traditional players have been standing on the sidelines. But I do want to hear, at a time when I know people are very worried about where the money is going to come from, what positive momentum you see in this space. For example, I know the DFC can now make equity investments, and that's a big change. So what's positive momentum you see in terms of directing money to these kinds of investments?
I think there is a huge amount of increased appreciation for, well, one thing I say, venture capital and private investment isn't a solution to all problems. Yeah. What you need is specialization and the willingness of funders and finance experts and global health experts to come together. And it's a lot of work. And the problem a lot of times is the upside isn't as great as just kind of, it's easy to write a grant and connect the dots to the grant's impact. If you work in venture capital, it's a lot easier probably to make money in oncology and so on. But if you care about all these different challenges and you want to be better prepared for the future, I have a huge amount of optimism that increasingly the world really appreciates that. And additional capital will flow not just into pure venture in the sense that we do it, but also what's called blended finance, where you get a little help on the downside protection. Someone guarantees a portion of your losses, or you get a kicker if things go well, or you have this bonus from pooled procurement. So I'm really bullish about the future, despite, especially in a climate where vaccines aren't necessarily in favor. At the end of the day, like your groupie strep example, moms want this, the world needs it.
So despite your optimism, there are many people, I think, who still look at the public health challenges that you're working to address with venture capital tools and see this as a space for aid rather than investment. So what's your main message for those who might still look at these issues through that lens?
Definitely that aid is an essential part of this, whether you see it or not, because so much is upstream and basic academic research funded by nonprofits and by government agencies. mRNA didn't happen overnight. Whatever you think about the end utility of it, it's still a pretty amazing technology that hopefully will have a lot of future applications. But that took almost 40 years, I think, of basic R&D before a venture capitalist was willing to place a bet on forming a company, Moderna, and on our side of the shore, and BioNTech on the other side, that then turned into a very successful business model. So you just need to think about the big picture and be somewhat bold in how you approach, bold and humble at the same time. That a lot of investment capital can cherry pick great deals, but they didn't just fall off the tree. The government and nonprofits had to kind of water the acorn to grow it in the first place.
That's a great analogy to end with, and thanks for helping illustrate how those deals come together. Looking forward to following what you do at Adjuvant. Thank you, Glenn, and please join me in thanking Glenn.
Thanks, Catherine.